Ask unanimous consent that my intern, Sarah Finley, be granted privileges of the floor for the balance of the day.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, I am coming to the floor to talk about the challenge we have with forest fires that have been raging in the West, from Montana and Idaho and Washington and Oregon and California. And periodically we have devastating fires in Colorado and New Mexico, Nevada. So we have to figure out how we do a better job in a multitude of ways. First, it's very important that we quit treating terrible fire years, enormous fires, as if they're some ordinary event, because there is currently no FEMA-style reaction to terrible forest fires. We respond with FEMA for tornadoes, and with floods, and with tidal waves, and with hurricanes, and with earthquakes, but not with forest fires. Well, the result is that the Forest Service runs out of funds to fight the fires in a bad year. And then they have to drain all the other programs they're working on, including the programs to prepare for future timber cuts, the programs to thin the forests, the programs to repair the infrastructure in the federal forests, all these other efforts. And then they can't resume those efforts until we've restored their funding, which can come often far later. This fire borrowing has to end. And that's why we absolutely need to support the bill that Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo and others have been working on to say, let's create a FEMA-like structure for these worst fires, so we end this fire borrowing devastation of the fire accounts. So that absolutely needs to happen. But right now, there are three funding issues that we need to address. First, we need to help out the communities that have been impacted economically by these devastating fires. Some have been scorched directly. Others have been profoundly affected by the smoke in the community. Others have been affected by highways being shut down. Others have been impacted by tourism dropping dramatically. So it's very important that we send a message to the Department of Agriculture and the Small Business Administration, the Housing and Urban Development Department, to say, use your emergency programs to assist these communities. And we really should make sure that they're at the front of the line, along with those who have suffered the disasters in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico, for emergency loans and assistance from the Small Business Administration, and for an augmented share of community development block grants to assist them in a very flexible fashion. I had the chance to meet this weekend with leaders in the Rogue Valley to talk about how smoke had affected them. And company after company after company had been dramatically impacted. Some you would say was obvious. If you have a zip line company and tourists aren't coming because the smoke's very thick, you're going to be impacted. But others are a little less obvious. For example, the production of wine and the potential impact of the smoke both directly and the fires directly on the harvest, but then also on perhaps tainting the flavor of the wine, which will have an impact down the road. So we need to make sure we do all we can to assist these communities, just as we're assisting the communities that have been devastated by Harvey and Maria and Irma. The second thing we need to do is we need to include $200 million in the next package, the third tranche of assistance for the disasters this year. $200 million to fund the repair and replacement of infrastructure and trail infrastructure that was damaged, the buildings and the trails that were damaged by these forest fires. Now that $200 million, that goes half to trails and infrastructure that was damaged by the hurricanes and half to those impacted by the fires. Essentially, the damage was roughly equally split. Without this type of funding, the Forest Service will be forced to postpone or cancel projects in fiscal year 2018 to accommodate the recovery. It will compromise the work to remove hazardous trees for public safety, road and trail maintenance, restoring vegetation in watersheds, and rehabilitating wildlife and fish habitat. The third thing we have to do is seize the moment and invest in fire resilience. every single time we have a fire season like this, and this season we spent twice as much, almost twice as much as average to fight the fires. People say, why don't we do more on the front end to reduce the risk of these fires? Well, that's such logical thinking, to do more on the front end. And what do they mean by that? Well, we have millions of acres of second growth forests. We clear cut them. Some of them regrew naturally. Others were replanted. We replant virtually everything now. And after you have 10 or 20 years, the trees are very close together. The branches are very close to the ground. And this is prime territory for fires. Fires love this. Disease loves this. And so it becomes a real problem unless you go in and you thin the trees enormously, take out a lot of those trees, and you proceed to get rid of the hazardous fuels, the branches that have accumulated on the ground and so forth. But if you do those two things, those forests become much more resilient to fire. Now, when you're doing this on a stand that's a bit older, 20 or 30 years old, you also get a significant supply of saw logs for the mills. So this is a real win-win situation. You get a forest that is better in resisting fire. You get a forest that's better in resisting disease. You get a forest that is better for timber stands. And you get a forest that is better in terms of being an ecosystem. So with all that winning, we need to do more to make it actually happen. In my state of Oregon, there are 1.6 million acres that have already gone through the environmental process. They are ready to be thinned and have the hazardous fuels removed. In Washington state, it's at least 400,000 acres. There's additional, probably hundreds of thousands of acres in every state from Montana and Idaho to California, Nevada, New Mexico. This picture shows the difference. This road right here had a stand on the left that had not been thinned. And if you can make out the colors, these trees are dead. They're all brown, dead trees because of the heat of the fire when it swept through. This side of the road had been treated. The trees had been thinned. The brush had been taken out from below. They often call that mowing. It had had prescriptive fire in it, which means after you've thinned it, you may go 10 or 15 years and then let fire burn up the shrubs at the base. And therefore, this side of the road, the forest is undamaged. In fact, I went out to this area outside of Sisters, Oregon this last weekend, and it's just remarkable how the area that had been thinned and treated with mowing and prescription fire became very resistant to the fire that was sweeping towards Sisters. And it really helped the Forest Service fight the fire because they can easily maneuver through the area that's been thinned much more than the area that hasn't been thinned. So that Millie fire, it was stopped before it got to Sisters, thankfully. In other places where the forest hadn't been thinned, the outcome might have been very different. So let us invest now in this win-win. Let us not succumb to the traditional timber wars of the past. Because after these fires like this, there are those folks who come along and say, we just need to clear cut everything. Let's do a 10,000 square foot timber sale with no environmental review and allow everything to be cut. That's the 1950s. In fact, we have a bill in this chamber that says do exactly that, and you can take out the old growth and the big trees. The irony of that is those are actually the trees that are fire resistant. Those are the trees you want to leave. So this is a solution that brings the environmental world and the timber world together and provides a supply of saw logs for our mills. Let's make that type of vision happen. But to do that, we have to fund the effort. We have to have the funds to be able to go in and do that thinning and mowing and fire prescription. That's why we're asking for about $600 million to help in the forests of Montana and Idaho and Washington and Oregon, California, Nevada, New Mexico, and wherever else there's a forest that's gone through that environmental review and it's ready for action. It's ready for action, and let's put Americans to work out in those forests in this win-win strategy. 3 things we need to do: help out our communities that are scorched, proceed to invest in emergency repair of the damaged infrastructure on our forest lands, and invest a significant $500 to $600 million in thinning the forests that have already gone through an environmental review. Thank you, Mr. President.